the goal of life is not to live a life with zero stress. It's actually biologically impossible to do that
Mm.
because, as we know, physiologically, so in the body, that cortisol hormone, which is your stress hormone, spikes. It goes way up in the early morning hours. And it's quite literally what gets you out of bed in the morning. A little bit of healthy stress. But when that healthy stress goes haywire, off the rails, when it becomes a runaway train and becomes unhealthy stress, that's what we're talking about. And that's when you have to really pay attention. Now, stress is often found to be correlated with rather than causing lots of medical symptoms. And in one study, which is shocking, found that 60 to 80% of all primary care visits have a stress related component. That's not to say that stress causes these symptoms, but certainly worsens symptoms. Like I had. I had palpitations and I went to go see a doctor. It wasn't actually my heart, it was stress. In the same way, 60 to 80% of all doctors' visits have this same sort of presentation, all sorts of symptoms. And yet, my research has found that only 3% of doctors counsel for stress. And so
Mm.
my work really aims to close that gap. But when you're thinking about stress, when you and I talk about stress, or like, oh, I've had a stressful day or a week, or in many people's cases, including ours, it's like I've had a stressful 4 years, right? But stress, it's not all equal. And in fact, there are two kinds of stress there is healthy stress and unhealthy stress. Good, healthy stress, in scientific terms, is called adaptive stress.
Mm.
It moves your life forward. Whereas unhealthy stress, the kind that you and I talk about, we're like, oh, I'm so stressed. That's actually unhealthy stress. It's dysfunctional, unproductive, gets in the way of your everyday life. It's called maladaptive stress scientifically. And those two affect your brain and body very differently.
Mm.
Examples of positive, healthy, good stress: rooting for your favorite sports team, falling in love, getting a promotion or a new job, planning a vacation. Us three getting together on this call, which, by the way, has taken quite a lot of juggling with our schedules and a major technical snafu on my end last month. And so all of these are examples of healthy, positive stress. However, unhealthy stress, we all know lots of examples of that, is what causes the mental and physical health manifestations. Now, that's not to say that the goal of life is not to live a life with zero stress. It's actually biologically impossible to do that
Mm.
because, as we know, physiologically, so in the body, that cortisol hormone, which is your stress hormone, spikes. It goes way up in the early morning hours. And it's quite literally what gets you out of bed in the morning. A little bit of healthy stress. But when that healthy stress goes haywire, off the rails, when it becomes a runaway train and becomes unhealthy stress, that's what we're talking about. And that's when you have to really pay attention. So the goal of life is not zero stress. It's a life with healthy, manageable stress that serves you rather than harms you. And a lot of my work focuses on transforming your relationship with stress away from dysfunctional back to productive that really can move your life forward.
Yeah, it was interesting. You stated that these different kinds of stresses actually affect the brain differently. Are you able to describe how these different stresses affect the brain a little bit differently?
I mean, more so, I don't think there have been, to my knowledge, any particular studies looking at like fMRI, for
Mm.
example, to see how what parts of the brain light up with different sorts of these kinds of healthy or unhealthy stress. But what I'm simply stating is that stress is on a spectrum. And when it's on the healthy, positive side, it moves your life forward. It's motivating. And
Mm.
most likely, you're being led by the prefrontal cortex, right? Which is the area right behind your forehead that governs things like memory, planning, organization, complex problem solving. These are
Mm.
all positive things, what we in science and medicine call general executive functions.
Mm.
When you are at the top of your game, you have a little bit of healthy stress, your life is moving in a positive direction. That's all the prefrontal cortex that's really making things happen. But when you are in the unhealthy stress range, you are being led by another part of your brain called the amygdala. And that is deep within your brain. It's an almond shaped structure, and its focus is that's where your stress response lives. It's fight or flight. And that focus of your amygdala is cave person mode. And its focus is immediate survival, your needs, and self preservation. And you can function for short periods of time in amygdala mode because your brain and body are expertly designed to handle short bursts of acute stress. But what we are facing now is ongoing chronic stress. It doesn't seem to really have an end. And that fight or flight response from your amygdala is very much about, fighting that tiger in the forest. You either fight the tiger or you run away. This is evolutionarily speaking. But now all of these tigers are metaphorical. We're not meeting tigers in the forest anymore. We're talking about financial constraints, relationship constraints, climate crises, and humanitarian crises all over the world. And our amygdala doesn't recognize the difference between what's happening in our backyard and what's happening thousands of miles away. And so that difference in how your brain registers healthy, positive stress and unhealthy stress is really about these two regions, your prefrontal cortex and amygdala. And the goal in the work that I do and the work that you do and in this conversation is to move away from amygdala mode back to the prefrontal cortex, out of survival mode, back to thriving.
Yeah. I love the way that you talk about changing your relationship with stress. And I like that we started with the better side of stress because really, as you mentioned, the purpose for humans is to have stress that we adapt to. And in so doing, we develop certain skills, strengths. And I look at that in a similar way to pain. Pain is not an experience human beings have that is all bad. In fact, if we didn't have pain, just as if we didn't have stress, we wouldn't survive. And that's well known. But I think about the amygdala in somewhat the same way that it's not all bad. The amygdala, in fact, I would expand the two F's to four F's. It's for fight, flight, feed, and fostering relationships, right? And so if you get what I'm saying, it's also an approach part of the brain that looks for reward, looks for positive things. But the point is that both pain and stress and ways of fueling the body's effort come from these regions that then need to be turned on quickly to handle a demand and turned off quickly. So that's where I always go with the warriors that we see who have chronic pain.